Hi, I'm Sumit. Welcome to this week's Net Hero podcast. Now, where are we in the world of sustainability? It's something that, we've been looking at, obviously, for years and years and years. And the whole idea of Future Net Zero is to try and encourage you as business people to think about what you can do to make a contribution, because better business leads to a better planet. But the state of sustainability varies in people's eyes. Some people say we're doing really well. Some people say we're not doing enough. You took a sample of 100 people in the street, you'd probably find quite a few people who are very, caring about the environment, maybe even vociferous. A lot of people who probably are thinking we're doing okay. And maybe I think the majority think, well, I'm not really that bothered. But the change is upon us. It's happening. And today, I'm really happy to say I've got a guest who's joining the podcast who's kind of been at the forefront of this. Way back, before there was even a planet, I think, she's been doing this stuff. Julia Hales, thank you very much for joining us on the Net Hero podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Julia, thanks very much for joining us. Now, tongue-in-cheek, I said that you've been around since sustainability began. But, in all seriousness, you were looking at this many, many years ago. Can you explain A, your background, how you got into this, and B, which I think is very fascinating, in the very early days, how you decided to talk to business about this? Because there have been people who've been always worried about the environment, but they've kind of been entrenched in their own kind of eco-communities. But you sort of saw the need to talk to business very early on. So take us back to how this all began.
Okay, so I started working in sustainability, environmental things in the mid-1980s. I started working with someone called John Elkington, who's very well known in that sphere. Should probably get him on your podcast. And we realised very early on that it's very important for people to recognise that there was a clear link between everything that we do is going to impact on the environment in one way or the other. And it's not just the specific impact that we're having, but actually almost most importantly, it's the message that we're sending back to business. So a very good example of that is that we started writing, we wrote a book called The Green Consumer Guide, which was published in 1988. It became an instant bestseller, 11 print runs in the first few weeks, and ultimately sold over 1 million copies worldwide. If we hadn't done that, someone else would have done that. But it caught the zeitgeist. And when I was researching that book, I rang all the supermarkets about what they were doing environmentally. And none of them had any idea what we were talking about.
No, of course not, yeah.
Completely like man from the moon stuff, didn't know about it. However, the next book that we wrote specifically focused on supermarkets. And I then rang them, so this was like 9 months later, after the publication, or 6 months after the publication, and asked them about what they were doing. Every single supermarket had brought in an environmental advisor in that short period of time. So it really illustrated how they recognized that this was something for them. It was something for their customers were concerned about, and they wanted to appeal to the green consumer.
Can I just take you back one step? So are you an ecologist by background, or what's your sort of background?
I'm definitely not an ecologist in my background, and actually, I'm really facing the sort of repercussions of that now, because I'm doing wilding projects and I'm learning so much about ecology, but that isn't where I started. And in fact, I had no formal training at all.
I love it. So what's your background?
Well, I did a lot of traveling.
Yeah, cool.
And it was actually when I was traveling that I really got concerned about the destruction of the rainforest. And that was probably the biggest motivator for me, is saying, I have got to do something to stop that. And in fact, very recently, I've become an ambassador for the Rainforest Trust. So full circle, come round to that again.
So your experience of traveling, sorry to interrupt, but that sort of triggered your environmental consciousness rather than having done a degree or work with that?
I think it certainly did. It probably built on some something that was in there, but it definitely got me motivated. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not supporting people trying to ban flights and that type of thing, because I think it's terribly important for people to go out and to travel and to see what's happening on the ground. And I could certainly expand on that.
No, that's for sure. Why did you think at that time, you and John, about writing a book and approaching business in the first place? Because I said at the beginning, there's always been green movements, right? Since probably post-war, even earlier. Generally, they've been protesting and against. We've got XR and all these things now. But many, particularly in those days, would never have thought about engaging business. Why did you particularly want to write a book about consumerism and green and then approach, like you said, the supermarket? What made you think, I want to talk to business?
Well, I think John had been working with business in more subtle ways, in a way, trying to encourage them and doing things. But in particular, what we recognised is that so many of the issues came down to what they were doing, and the fact that they would say, businesses, there's no demand for
Yeah.
greener products. Why should we be doing anything? So we recognised that actually we were appealing to consumers because people were thinking, what can I do? And then we were helping them with the ideas. And at the same time, we were then saying to businesses, people are concerned, you need to be paying attention to these people, and these are your customers. And we did surveys at the time showing that there were obviously some deep green people who were always going to be doing a lot, but there was a huge swathe, and this was sort of proper market research, there was a huge swathe of consumers who really wanted to do something but didn't know what they could be doing. And we caught that zeitgeist. If we hadn't written it, somebody else would have done, because there were lots of people there. And after we had the success with the Green Consumer Guide, it wasn't us approaching business, it was the other way around. They swarmed to us and they came and they said, look, we realize this is important. What on earth do we do about it? We started advising them with doing environmental audits, doing life cycle assessments of their products, and essentially looking at what they could do to change the focus of their business to put environment much further up the agenda. On a par, John developed a marvelous term called the triple bottom line, looking at financial, environmental, and social impacts. And that became a very standard thing that businesses started picking up on and recognizing they had a responsibility on all three fronts.
It's funny, isn't it? So this is late 80s, early 90s. And I remember, I'm pretty old, so I remember that time very well. And I don't remember much about that. I remember at uni, did we really care about plastic? Certainly not. Did we really think about it was all about buying jeans or getting stuff, and consumerism was coming in. We were getting cheap goods from China. But I noticed the things started to change. And a bit like you, when you said travelling, I went travelling, and I remember finding in Australia years ago a bin in the park which was recycled material, and I've never seen such a thing like that. Looking now, how business has taken up this mantle, it seemed to me, and maybe you can tell me you know better, there was a massive lag from the initial kind of, they're aware, they think there's a right, to really doing things. And that's really picked up the last 5-10 years. Why do you think, or have I got that wrong? Do you think there's been a gradual shift over the last 30 years, or is it all really happened recently?
Do you remember about ozone-friendly aerosols?
Yes, I do.
Aha, there you are. That happened in the
I
late
do.
80s.
CFCs, yeah, that's right, yeah.
CFCs in aerosols, in refrigeration, whatever.
Yeah.
So that was part of our Green Consumer campaign. It was raising awareness about that. It's one of the most successful consumer and environment campaigns that's ever been, because actually there was a shift. People became very aware about that.
Absolutely,
it picked up on. And we actually had a bit of a run-in with McDonald's at the time on a whole range of things. We had to be very careful because they were
like to sue just before we start this.
We were very close to being one of their victims, but fought back hard. And one of the things that we picked up on was the whole thing of CFCs in the foam packaging that they used at that stage. Yeah. And so, although we piggybacked another issue to get in, but they then said they were going to come out of CFCs in foam packaging. So the manufacturer of that foam packaging, they responded instantly, because at the beginning they had the legislators saying, oh no, it's very important, this packaging industry, it's going to cost us £1 million, etc. McDonald's said, we're going CFC free in our packaging. They just did it straight off. And so the market, it was the power of market forces, and that was the biggest impact that we had, regardless as to things. It was because we knew there were consumers out there were concerned, but that put the message on these companies. It made them do things that they would not have otherwise done, and it shifted business. And at the same time, I was sitting on the eco-labelling board, and we were looking at phosphates in detergents, about what's happening with nappies, what paints, all sorts of different areas. And all of those sectors were listening to what we were doing and responding. So you as the consumer may not have been aware about the changes that were going on in business, but it was during that time that businesses started employing people to look at environmental things, to look across the board at what they were doing. I think that my contention is, having started in at that stage,
Yeah,
is that we thought it was very exciting and there were lots of things going on, but it
absolutely.
wasn't
Yeah.
nearly enough. And
Yeah.
we started with our company, sustainability, looking, and obviously the concept of sustainability is living within our means, living within what, the resources that the planet has. Now, nearly 40 years on, we're so far beyond living sustainably that we have to start looking at regeneration and putting things back and repairing the damage. And I can go on to talk to a little bit about businesses and why I think they need to be doing so much more than what they are now.
The and we will discuss that in a second. The whole thing you said there is very interesting because you're now triggering loads of memories of me of things. Obviously, working as a journalist, I remember writing the stories about the nappies and all of these things, and it's very interesting how that all comes back to you. Where would you sit when an environmental campaigner would say to you, "I don't think you should be talking to businesses"? Right? You said earlier we should be flying. There's a lot of people who say we shouldn't be flying. I've had people on this podcast saying, "Why? How dare people fly? How dare people take any other form of transport except a bicycle or something like that?" Before we talk about where businesses should be now, where do you think the green lobby has changed over the last 40 years? Do you think there's become a much more zealous element of green, which is really against any kind of thing that you've had, which is dialogue with business?
No, I think it was really, actually, I've got a marvelous story which I can tell you about. That is, I spoke at the Green Party conference in 1989,
Right.
and I was booed and heckled from the audience. And they said, "Why have we got someone on the platform who's making money out of the environment?" At the same time as challenging me on that, in the lobby of the Green Party conference, for the very, very first time, they were selling greener products like Ecover. And why were they doing that? Because of us and our Green Consumer Guide, because they were beginning to engage in the positive side of what business could do on that front. So yes, absolutely, there are always going to be the sort of more purists who were doing that. We were in a very interesting position because, in some ways we were cursed by the green lobby because
Yeah.
we were with business. At the same time, I gave a speech to ICI, who were very
Yeah.
big, they were
Yeah.
CFCs, and they were really challenging me about that. In fact, at the time that I went to do that, they were denying that CFCs were affecting the ozone layer. And
So
I
you're
was in
stuck in the middle between the two. It's very
we were
interesting.
in the middle with a foot in both camps,
Yeah.
advising the businesses and picking up on the issues from the green lobby. And eventually, actually, not long after we did that, probably in the early 90s, Greenpeace launched a magazine called Greenpeace Business.
Yes,
And
I
that
remember
we
that.
were
Yeah.
very much working with them and, thinking, well, that was brilliant because they needed to engage more. If you attack business completely, the only response has to be to ignore you because they can't do anything. What we wanted to do is we wanted to say, actually, business has the solutions. If we get businesses to change, we can push government to move faster. We can really change things. More people want to work for the businesses that are leading on this thing, engaging them in those type of things. So although I do occasionally, campaign with boards, I walk better at COP26. But I very much understand that the importance of working with business and getting them to value and recognize the value of what can be done. And I've launched several campaigns which is really picking up on that competition between businesses, how good they are on different sectors. So just to bring up one, I work with the Environmental Investigation Agency, trying to highlight the importance about supermarkets and wider companies getting out of basically ozone and climate change refrigeration
Yeah.
products.
Yeah.
And what we did was it was a campaign called the Chilling Facts campaign. And it's great because what we did is we compared all the different supermarkets how they compared on what they were doing, how quickly they were going to get out of it, how it weighted to their refrigeration, their transport, their, opening doors, all sorts of different things within that sector. And they moved because they all had to respond and they saw that competition. And it's a very, very effective way of getting change.
I agree with everything you've said. One thing that I want to explore is the issue of the green consumer, right? You launched the consumer guide. Are we really that much greener than we were? I think we're more aware. And, certain people like, I've ditched my plastic razors and I've gone old school. Found something like my dad's old, safety razor. I've gone to that and I've certainly changed things, but I'm not an eco, a warrior, but I've just realized that there's no need. There's things that I can do. And I've certainly only done that more since we started Future Net Zero because I've been aware of how much we're eating and how much food waste and all of that. Do you think in general there's a feeling that consumers, and again, there's 2 points I'd like to tell. One is, are consumers getting greener? And B, is that really just the Western consumer? Then, looking at it globally.
It's such a big question, actually. It's interesting because I've got two sons working in the environment, and certainly my eldest son is a lot more radical than I am, but he doesn't really feel the power of the consumer because he thinks that we're working within the society we've got, and we've got relative little choice to make a difference within that context. I actually don't think that because I do see the power of the consumer in terms of pushing their messages to business and changing that culture. And I can see how that's worked in terms of things. And I don't think that you can sit there saying the consumer is not making any difference, because I think that increased awareness, is the government ever going to tax fuel or flights or any of the negative things if the majority of people think that's a whole load of rubbish and they don't want it? Are they going to do it if actually the majority of people are thinking actually they welcome that and they're prepared to shift their behavior patterns? Much more likely. So we have to be able to demonstrate we care through what we consume, what we buy, and how we act in that respect.
What
Is
about,
it a thing?
the Western thing, What's your view on that?
So my view on that is, I think that one of the things that annoys me more than anything else is when people say, well, why are we bothering to do anything? And look what they're doing in China. I could throttle anyone that does that. So don't ever tell that to me because I think it's rubbish. And the part of the reason why I think it's rubbish is for the same way about the message going to business. If we are here demonstrating the state of the art of what can be done and what we should be doing, it's so much more likely that they will be doing that too.
Of course.
And you also have to understand that the population in China is X zillion pounds bigger. And if you measure it per head, they're not having a bigger impact than us.
Absolutely. And this thing, you were at COP in Glasgow, I think, same as me. And, the thing I liked, I thought that I had mixed feelings on COP, but the thing I liked was meeting people from Botswana, Venezuela, the Philippines and China and Southeast Asia. And the fact is that people wanted to do things, but at their own, they're going to do what they've got to get their people out of poverty. They've got to give them energy. They've got to give them health. But they're not unaware of what's going on. And I think this kind of preaching thing doesn't work.
Can I just say, just to bring in an issue about that, is that there's a marvelous book that's been written called The Life Cycle, and it's about this lady cycling from the top of South America to the bottom on a bamboo bicycle.
Right.
Which is incredible. But she has highlighted all the issues about biodiversity as part of her trip. And the thing that is really powerful in there is meeting these campaigners, and they are fighting those extractive industries that are fueling
mining and all of that. Yeah, absolutely.
And those are in direct conflict with biodiversity and destroying the forests and all those different things. So all these things are incredibly mixed. And there are people out there trying to do that. And they're trying to say, how can these countries get money apart from extractive industries? One of the areas, tourism. So that brings us back to flights again. So the whole thing is it's looking holistically at these things to really understand the impacts we're having and how powerful us as individuals are in terms of the changes that we can bring about.
Where would you say, if you were doing the report card, having been there at the beginning, a lot of businesses have talked the talk. I don't think anywhere near enough have walked the walk. But, a couple of years ago, everyone was declaring we're going net zero by this date with this, that, whatever. We've seen some shift. Definitely seen a lot of shifts in terms of products we can get, and the fact that you can now get metal straws and all these things for kids' parties. There is things happening. We do events. I'm sure you've been to events where conferences now offer bamboo plates, and things are changing. Businesses are looking at their supply chains. But overall, would you say, looking at it, businesses doing it as they really want to be innovative, to get a market lead? Or do you think they're being kicked and dragged along to do this?
Gosh, that's a really big question because it raises so many different issues, which I will try and cover very swiftly.
Your gut feeling is all I need,
Yeah.
really.
So basically, I just say net zero has good and bad about it.
Yeah.
I sort of hate it in some ways because it implies that
Oh
you know
dear.
you got to net zero, it's enough, and
No. Understood.
things. Actually, you want to do as much as you possibly can. You don't want to stop at any particular point. You want
Yeah.
to do as much as you can. In terms of businesses, obviously that makes it a bit more tangible in some ways. But what I think is that so many businesses are saying we want to do exactly what we're doing, but a little bit greener. And I think that's rubbish because actually what we want is businesses having a vision which is saying we are going to do what we can to repair the planet, to stop deforestation, to basically bring back all the things, biodiversity, whatever, to halt climate change. We're going to use the power that we have to do that and try and make money and use our expertise in the process. So I don't think it's a conflict between making money and doing good, but I do think it's a conflict in terms of staying with the same business remit as you ever had before. If you take the big oil companies, I don't think they should be just piling on more and more oil exploration, etc., etc. They should be putting that money into micropower, improving the grid, increasing renewables, whatever. So it's shifting the focus, and it's bold, and it's got to be big because otherwise it's just not going to be nearly enough.
We as a people are struggling, right? I mean, let's be honest, the cost of living crisis hit everyone. But I still feel that there's a role for all of this. Do you think that a lot of us, maybe I'm guilty of it myself, we have very good intentions, but when it comes to that issue of will I pay more for that greener product, or will I do something less that puts me at a slight, I'll have to drive less or do less or take a smaller car, whatever. Do you think we as consumers maybe have a real problem there? Because it's a really difficult one of human nature. It's like going on a diet, isn't it? You always want to do it, but you think it's going to be good because you can see the goal, but doing it is flipping hard.
I certainly agree that doing it is hard. And I think that one of the things is that people have so many misperceptions about what is the right thing and what isn't.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult communicating that. So I think that one of the things that you sort of brought up is, can't we just rely on companies to do the right thing and that would be better? And in some ways, I sort of agree with you because
you take the choice out of it for me as the consumer.
Because it's too complicated. So,
Yeah.
when Marks and Spencer started, for example, responding to the green issue, they were actually fairly low down in the pecking order of companies in terms of what they were doing. However, they leapfrogged the others. And one of the reasons
Plan A.
they did, Plan A was very good. And I did some work with them in advance of that. And one of the reasons why they did leapfrog the others is because they were actually trying to work out what was actually better, proper thinking. So they weren't just leading on to, they weren't just banning plastics. They were looking at how to make sure that we reused as much as possible, that we put recycled plastic materials into their plastic bags. And, for example, with clothes, I thought it was really interesting. They established that one of the most powerful things that they could do to save carbon in relation to textiles and fashion was to reduce on the labels, which said the temperature of the wash, to reduce that from 60 to 30.
Yes.
So it's thinking laterally, thinking about the issues that are involved and coming up. However, I remember Tesco coming in with biodegradable plastic bags, which I think are a rubbish idea. Doesn't make sense for consumers, but everyone latched on. Oh, this is brilliant. We're all doing that. They were just climbing on a bandwagon and misinforming consumers. And I think that was really a rotten thing to do. But we have to have companies who properly understand it and are properly trying to make a difference.
I'm sure Tesco, just for legal reasons, would probably say that they had the good intention there, but I get your wider point.
It
So
was a
let's
while ago, so they may have changed.
they may have
You
changed,
know,
yeah. But let's get back to this fundamental point before we end, which is, you know, in a funny way, we're doing something with Future Net Zero that you started at the beginning, the conversation with business, that business does these things to change. And then we as consumers go along with it. When you look at the plethora of information now, right? You and I grew up in the time of newspapers, a bit of radio, a bit of TV. I mean, the online information world is overwhelming, but there's so much disinformation and misinformation out there. Do you think there's an impetus on finding ways to communicate better, particularly for businesses, to avoid the greenwashing, to be accountable, but also for us as consumers so that we don't follow a TikTok trend or things like that, particularly young kids? They believe so much without ever looking to see anything verified, a rumour. Does that worry you, that the way that the information, because change comes from knowledge comes from understanding, and if where we're getting our understandings wrong, then our impression of what we should do is wrong?
I totally agree with that. And yes, it does worry me because I think that people take a very simplistic approach. So if you take the whole issue of plastics, I really, in some ways, I sort of welcomed the fact that there was a huge amount of awareness about waste because we are an incredibly wasteful society and there are terrible things that are being done. But it drove me completely mad that everyone used to just say, ban plastics, get rid of plastics and everything. That would be a
Absolutely.
nonsense. Plastics are a lightweight material. They're a miracle material in all sorts of ways. If we ban plastics, the amount of energy it would use would be far, far greater. So, and the main issue with plastics, there are a few, but the main issue with plastics is getting into the waterways.
Of
So
course.
shouldn't we be really looking at what are the things that are getting plastics into our waterways? Not designing plastic so it's all right if it gets in our water, because we don't want it in there in the first place. And by the way, biodegradable plastic will not biodegrade in the sea because it's too cold. So there are all sorts of things that, you know, we have all these misperceptions about, you know, what to do. And the same for disposable plastics is that effectively, if you actually recycle them and you use recycled materials, there's got to be a market for recycled material
Yeah.
as opposed to virgin material. That's really important. So the circular economy keeping within the system is really important. That's what my son's business is all about, Rubbish Ideas, is helping people move towards that circular economy. But in many ways, it can actually be better than reusable containers. So if you take a festival or event, sometimes they're doing, you know, reusable cups and they're
Yeah.
saying this is so
Yep.
much better.
They
But you
do.
have
Yeah.
to, some of them have been sending those cups abroad to get washed. Has anyone ever thought about what that might mean?
What a
I think
carbon footprint. Yeah.
what a carbon footprint that is. Some of them have reusable containers, but how many times are they actually reused? And they have to be heavier in order to make them. So if they're not used enough times, that's not any good either. People take them away as souvenirs because they put a date on
Yes.
them.
Yeah.
What's the point of that? So there are all these different things, and that's in a way the biggest point I want to make in relation to this thing is that so many of the things we need to look much more holistically at the impacts of what we're doing, whether it's flying, whether it's planting trees, whether it's about plastics. We need to have a much more sophisticated understanding. And I think the role of business is to properly research these issues, make sure they truly understand them, and lead the way towards the solutions that are innovative, bold, and properly factually going to make a difference environmentally, because we are in a crisis and we need proper action, and business is in an excellent place to be a leader on this front.
That is the best place to end. Juliet, you've been fantastic to talk to. I'd love to speak to you again. I'd love to get you to come and talk at our conference next year. So we'll have a catch up on that. A final word. Are you still positive about the things 40 years on from when you first got into this world? Do you think we're getting things right, at least a little bit, to make things better for the next generation?
Well, I think we're doing a lot more than when I started, but the situation is much more urgent than when I started. And I'm afraid to say that I've become slightly more pessimistic because I really, really do not think we're doing enough. And I do think that there's just so much more that needs to be done. If you see the fires happening all over the
Yeah.
planet, the increased storms, the floods, the whatever, you know, I still meet people who tell me that it's nothing, that there's nothing going on, there's nothing wrong. I totally disagree with that. And I think we really need to act. And I'm afraid I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the ability to get people to really do what's needed to be done.
Well, I'm sure you'll be holding everyone to account. Julia, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the Net Hero podcast.
Great. Look forward to seeing it.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you very much to Julia. Remember, you can subscribe to the podcast, get in touch. What have you got to say? What have you thought what she said? Would you agree with Julia? Then you can email nethero@futurenetzero.com, and please keep subscribing and let us know if you've got a story to tell about what you're doing to try and improve our awareness on sustainability. See you next time.
You've been listening to the Net Hero podcast with Sumit Bose from Future Net Zero. Visit our platform for all things net zero. And if you or your business is doing great things on the path to net zero and want to be featured on the podcast, email nethero@futurenetzero.com. Follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.